In this session, we'll be talking about the concepts of rural settlement and urban settlements. Now, when we talk about these two concepts, it is necessary to talk first about what do we mean by settlements, so that we can go further to talk about what is rural and what is urban settlement. Now, the word settlement is connected with the verb to settle. And here to settle basically means to occupy an area, to occupy space, or to dwell or to live in a particular place. Now, technically, settlement can be defined in different ways. There are two definitions on the slide. The first definition is by Sumita Ghosh, and according to this definition, settlement is a collection of man-made structures put up with the intention of habitation or social economic use, which forms a spatial unit for human interaction. Now, if you understand this definition better, it is useful to divide this definition into smaller portions, so that becomes easier to understand. So settlement includes man-made structures. So it basically includes the built-up areas, all buildings and different kinds of constructions, includes transport, etc. So all man-made structures put together. Now, these man-made structures are used for various purposes. So the definition says that these structures are used basically for habitation, that is to stay, that is to dwell in those buildings. But at the same time, those buildings or the construction or the built-up area is also used for economic purpose, to carry out our economic activities and as well as social activities. So the intention, the objective of these man-made structures is social, economic, and as a basic need, habitation. Now, these two things, all these man-made structures meant for different purposes, when we put together, it becomes one spatial unit. It becomes one geographical unit. And most importantly, that without people, settlement is not possible. So these man-made structures, which are meant for various intentions or objectives, they become one unit with which people interact with each other, with which human beings interact with each other. And it is through this interaction a settlement is born. Okay, so this is what Sumita Ghosh is talking about. There is another definition by R.L. Singh. According to this definition, settlement is an occupants unit. By occupants here we mean that every settlement, every say a village or a city or a town, it occupies a certain geographical area, right? So some settlements are small, they occupy smaller areas. Some are very big, so they occupy a larger area. So settlement basically is an occupants unit. It occupies a geographical area, and it represents organized colony of human beings. So human beings together in a very dense population, they stay together, but the word is organized. So it is not a haphazard kind of grouping of human beings, but there is some organization, there is some pattern in that settlement. Now, this colony of human beings include buildings, that is the built-up area. And again, these buildings are put to use for a variety of purposes. They are used to live, people use these buildings to live, to work, or to store some items or commodities or goods and commodities in them, or use them for many other purposes, right? And the tracks or streets over which their movement takes place. Okay, so accordingly, settlement is a occupants unit. It occupies certain area where human beings stay. Now, to stay, they require buildings. So they use the buildings to stay. They use their buildings or the built-up area to carry out economic activities and many other activities. And all these buildings, all these built-up areas are connected. They are connected with roads or streets or tracks, and through which the or along which the movement of people, movements of goods and services is taking place. Okay. Now, both the definition, Sumita Ghosh and R.L. Singh definition, both have certain common things. Okay. Both talk about that settlements are fundamentally associated with people. So it is people who build settlements, and it includes number of structures that they use for variety of purposes, and it is through these structures they interact with each other, right? So this is what settlement fundamentally is. Now, settlements can be classified on various bases, on different criteria, and there is huge classification that we are going to learn later. But very broadly, very crudely, settlements can be classified in two ways. One, we call them as urban settlements, and other we call them as rural settlements. And when we say rural settlements, we have a very clear image of it, right? So when we say a village, and if we close our eyes, then we have a very clear image of what a village is, how it looks like, right? And similarly, we have an image of a city, of a metropolis, that how it looks like. And therefore, we very much know that both these imageries of a village and city, so they are quite different from each other, right? And so there is a difference between these two. Now, this difference, what we need to understand, and that is what we are going to do in this particular session. So let us understand them one by one. So first we will see what do we mean by rural settlements and what are the characteristics. And then we'll move into what do we mean by urban settlements. Now, it's very easy that when we say rural settlements and that imagery I was talking about, that I mean our conception that comes to our mind when we say rural settlement, it's obviously a settlement with much lesser population, very less number of houses. Okay, so rural settlements are associated with much less population as compared to the city or as compared to the urban settlement. And obviously, as the population is less, the number of houses are also less. Similarly, most of the people living in rural settlements are engaged in primary activities. You know that primary activities are extractive activities. They are more connected with nature, and such activities are the ones such as agriculture, livestock rearing, forestry, fishing, food gathering, hunting. So these are the practices in which most of the people in rural settlements are involved. Now, when we talk about different settlements, different kind of houses, so we find that the rural settlements include isolated huts or hamlets. Hamlet in Marathi, we call it as a wadi. So hamlet is a very few houses put together with plantations or with agricultural, with farmlands all around. Or villages can be little bigger than hamlets. We call them as small village or large village, right? So these are the ways in which rural settlement is understood, and based on what functions, what is the predominant function of that particular rural settlement, we then can call it the village as a farming village, as a fishing village, as a quarrying village, etc. So based on the predominant function, we can say that. And there are different other ways in which we can classify rural settlements, which we will be learning in the topics that are coming later. Now, when we talk about characteristics of rural settlements, so we have understood fundamentally that rural settlements are smaller in size, with less population, with very lesser number of houses, and people more engaged into primary activities. So that becomes our fundamental understanding. But then what are different features, different characteristics? Now we can group those characteristics into geographical characteristics, economic characteristics, demographic characteristics, and so on. So when we say geographical characteristics, we all just now we have said that rural settlements are small in size. Okay, so they occupy relatively less geographical area. Plus, villages or the settlements or the houses in the villages are not so dense. So there is spacing between and among the houses. Similarly, we find houses or the rural settlements are relatively closer to the nature. So when we visit rural settlements, we find that there is a lot of nature around, lot of greenery around. So more close to nature. Now, rural settlements also have a cooler weather. The temperatures are relatively less as compared to the cities, as compared to the urban areas, because there are much less sources of heat. There are much less sources through which heat is emitted, and therefore we find cities are relatively cooler as compared to villages are relatively cooler as compared to cities. Similarly, because villages are more engaged into primary activities and they are very closer to nature, even the environment of rural settlements is cleaner than the cities. So we have much less pollution. The gravity of pollution is much less as compared to the cities. If we see the houses of rural settlements, we see that these are usually built by the material which is available in the surrounding region. So traditional material such as mud, grass, wood, etc. So most of the rural settlement houses in the rural settlements are built by the natural material which is available in the surrounding region. We do not see usually skyscrapers and very tall buildings in the villages. We may get little, say, 2-story, 3-4-story buildings in a larger village. But when we say a very small village or a hamlet, we may get we only get a single houses without any vertical development of those houses. Now, the site of a village, that is the actual ground where the village comes up or comes first or gets established. So those are basically determined by natural factors. So villages develop at a particular place because the soil is fertile, because the water is available. So the factors that determine the presence of a village at a particular point is basically associated with the surrounding natural conditions. And if we see the overall land use of rural area, land use is the purposes for which the land is being used. So these land uses are more agricultural, obviously, because more people are engaged in agriculture or associated primary activities. So we find land around the villages, land around the houses in the villages have farmlands, more open spaces, grazing grounds. We can find some water bodies such as wells and tanks. So this is how the land use basically is. So these are the geographical characteristics of rural settlements. Demographically, population-wise, we have already seen that the number of people living in rural area is much less than the urban area. And what is that number? When we say less population, so less means how much population lives in villages, how much in cities. Now, these are very technical things and these are decided or determined by the respective governments. So what is considered as rural in one country may not be considered as rural in other countries. For example, in India, 5,000 is the limit. So because population or a place or a settlement with more than 5,000 persons is considered as urban. So it goes into urban classification. So in case of India, the settlement where the population is less than 5,000 is considered as rural. So rural population has much less, rural villages or rural settlements have much less population. Now, when we see the families in the rural areas or the rural settlements, we find that the families are of relatively large size. Because as we will see in the social features, most of the families in the rural areas are joint families. And therefore, there are more number of people that live in a family in the rural area. So it is relatively larger family size compared to urban area. Similarly, the population density in the rural settlements is also very low. By population density, we mean sorry, number of people per unit area. So when we see number of people per unit area or the population density, so that is much lower in rural settlements. We also find that there is a lot of migration taking place. There's a lot of movement of people taking place, and most of the movement takes place between a village and another village. So there is rural to rural mobility is much more, and at the same time we find rural to urban mobility. So people leaving the villages or rural settlements and moving to the city for the purpose of jobs. So rural to rural mobility and rural to urban mobility. So this is what population movement is what we find. Now, year to year, time to time, we find that how many people move from village to village and from village to city obviously undergo changes. Demographically speaking, rural settlements have relatively more infant mortality rates, relatively more as compared to the cities. Similarly, that they also have more number of working children as compared to the cities. Now, there are certain economic characteristics. The first one we already have seen, that the population in the rural settlement is much more engaged in primary activities such as agriculture and other allied activities. Rural settlements are relatively less developed in the terms of technology, and there is a very lesser degree of accessibility and connectivity. Reaching to a city is much more easier because the city is well connected by different kinds of transport. But however, rural settlements are not so, right? So rural settlements are not that easily accessible, or they are not so well connected as compared to the urban settlements or the cities. So generally we find the people or the population in the rural settlement, they suffer from scarcity, they suffer from deprivation in terms of basic infrastructure. So there is no much infrastructural development in the villages as compared to the cities. There is very little scope of occupational mobility because comparatively the job opportunities available in the cities are quite less as compared to the cities. And therefore we find that there is very less scope of occupational mobility, that is changing the occupation. You change from one occupation to another occupation if you feel that there is more money you are going to get there. So quick, easy shift from one job to other job, one occupation to other occupation is not that easy in rural areas as compared to urban areas. There is no strict division of labor in rural areas. In rural areas, one person has to do multitude of jobs, different kinds of work that a person carries out. It's not like in urban areas where there are very specialized specialization in terms of work, that certain people are specialized in certain kind of work only. This kind of specialization usually is not found in rural areas. Similarly, as compared to the cities, we find that the rural settlements have lower wage rates and even much lower per capita income. Administrative terms, rural villages are governed by local self-government authorities or local self-government bodies such as Gram Panchayat, village council, or district authorities, right? So when we say that a place or a settlement has a Gram Panchayat, it means that it's a rural settlement. When we say that a settlement has Mahanagar Palika or a municipal corporation, then it means that it is an urban settlement. So what is the authority, which government body, which self-government body is governing the place also determines or also defines what is rural and what is urban. In terms of socio-cultural characteristics, we find that rural settlements are more homogeneous in terms of society, because we usually do not find very large in-migration in rural area. What we usually find is out-migration. So as compared to the cities, the whatever features we are talking about here are not in absolute terms, but these features are in comparison with the urban area. So when we compare rural settlement with urban settlement, we find rural societies are more homogeneous. Okay. At the same time, they are very well stratified on the basis of caste. So in terms of India, so there is villages have very clear spatial units in terms of caste, right? So a lot of stratification as compared to cities. Cities are more stratified on the basis of class as compared to caste. Similarly, the interpersonal relations in rural settlements are more durable, they are more intimate, and rural settlement, the life in the rural settlement is relatively simple, the pace of life is relatively slower, the families have much stronger bonds, and we find that the traditional culture or the folk culture predominates in the rural areas. So this is what the rural settlement and their characteristics are. Urban settlements, in contrast to rural settlements, are the settlements with more population, so more number of houses, and people are more engaged in non-primary activities, that is secondary activities such as manufacturing, construction, or tertiary activities such as transport, banking and insurance, etc. Now, when we say urban settlements, we talk about towns, cities, metropolis, megalopolis, and so on. And again, based on what is the predominant function of an urban settlement, we can refer to a particular urban settlement as industrial city or educational city or a tourist center or entertainment center and so on. So urban settlement is basically a settlement with much large population, much large number of houses, and people predominantly engaged in secondary activities. Now, the question is how to classify, how to decide that this settlement is rural and this settlement is urban. Is there any objectivity in that decision, right? So, rural and urban can be classified on the basis of various criteria. On the various bases, it can be easily classified. The most predominant or the most used base or criteria for classifying rural urban is the size of population, as we have been talking about. Lesser the population, so we call it as rural. Higher the population, it becomes urban. And as I said, there are different figures in different countries, right? So, for example, if the population is of a settlement is more than 2,000, it becomes urban in countries like France and Germany. Or if it is 2,500, more than 2,500 becomes urban in case of United States. In India, just now we have seen that the figure is 5,000. So from country, so every country define what is rural and what is urban. And therefore, there is no there is no uniform criteria of classifying rural and urban. Number one. Number two, these criteria, these figures also go on changing, right? So it's not that some 20, 30 years before this rural urban was classified on the basis of same numbers of 2,000, 2,500 or whatever. So there is a change in the criteria, not only from country to country, but also from time to time. So this is an important aspect that needs to be considered. Population density, that is number of people living per unit area, is also considered as a defining or a defining criteria for what is urban and what is rural. We just now have seen that if the population density is higher, we call it as urban. If lower, we'll call it as rural. Now, again, economic base. So people, whether people are engaged in primary activities more or they are engaged in non-primary activities, that is another way of classifying rural urban. Or which government body, which local self-government body is governing that settlement. As just now I mentioned, whether it is a Gram Panchayat or it is a municipal corporation, that also decides what is rural and what is urban. And then there is functional basis, which is associated with economic base. As more people are engaged in primary activities in rural settlement and more people are engaged in non-primary activities in urban settlement, accordingly, those settlements have different functional base. different predominant functions of the cities. So on all these bases, we can find rural and urban can be classified. So what is urban in India? Okay, so the following are the conditions. I mean, if these conditions are there, then we call the settlement as urban in India as per the census notification, very latest census notification of 2021. The very first condition is, or the criteria is, all the administrative units that have been defined by statute as urban. So if the settlement is governed by municipal corporation, municipality, cantonment board, notified town area committee, town panchayat, or nagar palika. Okay, so these are all called as statutory towns, right? And these statutory towns with a population of 1 lakh and above are categorized as cities, right? So it is very important that a settlement is governed by which local self authority. Now, if the settlement is governed by any of these urban local self-government or government body, then it automatically becomes urban. So there is no question that it is rural, right? And all these things are declared under statutes, and therefore urban, the classification of urban in this case becomes very easy. But in other cases, there are 3 criteria that can be used to decide whether the place is urban or not. So the first criteria is a settlement with a minimum population of 5,000 persons, okay, or a settlement with 75% or above of their main working population engaged in non-agricultural pursuits, and a density of population of at least 400 persons per square kilometer. So if these 3 conditions are satisfied by a particular settlement, we call that settlement as urban. So the minimum population should be 5,000. So population has to be 5,000 or more than that. 75% of the male working population should be engaged in non-agricultural activities, and the population density of that place should be minimum 400 persons or more than that per square kilometer. So these are the criteria to call a settlement as urban in India. Now, what are the characteristics of urban settlements? Now, as we are looking into binary, so whatever we have talked about in the rural area, okay, now so the opposite of that is considered as urban. So some of the things we already have talked about. In case of urban settlement, the geographical characteristics, obviously the urban settlements are larger in size, right? Similarly, they are denser, they are compact, the spacing, the distance between and among houses is much less. Similarly, they are not so close to nature as compared to rural areas. Similarly, we find the temperatures are higher in the cities as compared to villages. So villages are cooler, but the cities have hotter weather, or they are hot in terms of temperature, and that is mainly because there are multiple sources through which the heat is emitted. So industries and vehicles, etc., and so much of population density, all these things emit a lot of heat in the air, making the cities hotter as compared to villages. Similarly, cities are more polluted, and the houses or the buildings in the urban settlements are built more by artificial or modern building material such as concrete, plastic, glass, etc. Similarly, the place where an urban settlement develops, okay, so the factors responsible for that are also man-made. So availability of a market or availability of an industrial raw material. So these can be the factors that will lead to the initial or a primary growth of an urban settlement. In urban settlements, we find skyscrapers, multi-storied buildings, because obviously the number of people are huge, while the comparatively the area available, geographical area available is less. So people stay in a very dense houses and buildings that are tall or multi-storied. The land use in urban settlement is more industrial. So when we look around the city, we find lot of buildings, industries, market areas, lot of transport facilities, or transport infrastructure all around. So that becomes the land use of the urban area. Population terms, we already know that urban settlements are settlements with very higher population. Usually in the urban areas, what we find are nuclear families. So the relatively compared to villages, the family size is relatively small. Population densities are quite higher, and the mobility, the movement of population is relatively more from city to city. So urban mobility is much more as compared to urban rural mobility. Similarly, compared to villages, I mean rural settlement, the infant mortality rates are relatively less, and the number of working children is also relatively less. In terms of economic features, we know that urban areas have people engaged in non-agricultural activities predominantly, while the infrastructure available in the urban settlement is much better compared, I mean, in quantitatively more as compared to rural areas. And therefore, the way people in rural areas suffer from scarcity and deprivation in terms of infrastructure, that kind of deprivation and scarcity overall in general is not faced by urban settlement. But it doesn't mean that all is well, because within the urban settlement we find there are localities which are deprived of infrastructure. So because there is unequal distribution of in infrastructure, so there are areas which are deprived and there are areas of affluence within the city. Now, occupational mobility is higher. The change of job or occupation is higher because obviously the job opportunities are much higher. The division of labor is very strict because people have taken a very specific education, so or they have very specified or specialized skill set, and therefore a labor or a urban labor carry out a specific kind of job. So very strict division of labor. And the wage rates or income rates or per capita income is very higher, comparatively higher as compared to rural area. Urban areas are also developed technologically. Similarly, urban areas, as we have seen earlier, are easily accessible. They are more better connected by different transport segments as compared to the rural areas. Administrative terms, again, we have seen in the census notification itself that urban settlements are governed by urban local self-government bodies like cantonment boards, municipal corporations, municipal councils, etc. Socio-culturally, because a city is mainly made by migrants and people from different socio-cultural backgrounds, socio-economic and cultural backgrounds, they migrate to the city. The society or the urban society is highly mixed, heterogeneous. So people from multiple social, economic, cultural backgrounds, they come together and they live in the city. So as compared to rural societies, urban societies are much more heterogeneous. Similarly, they are stratified much more on the class basis. So by class basis here, I mean rich and poor. So rich and poor classification is much more stricter, is much more stronger relatively as compared to villages. Similarly, the interpersonal relationships are not that intimate, right? So people live in the building, but most of the time people they do not know their neighbors very well. So very not like a village. So here the interpersonal relationships are not very intimate. They are not too durable also, right? So there is more impersonal kind of relationships, very casual, short-lived, or more formal and competitive kind of relationships we observe between the people. Similarly, the pace of life is quite high and the lives are more complex and complicated in urban areas. And there is much lesser hold, there is much lesser control of traditional values or a folk tradition or folk culture, while we find that the culture is more cosmopolitan. So the urban culture is more influenced by the global culture. So what's happening in the world is there's more influences the cities much more. So for example, a fashion. So fashion that comes in Europe, for example, first will come to the city in India, and then gradually it will travel in the lower order of the hierarchy to the villages and all. So socio-culturally, urban societies are more cosmopolitan in nature under global influences. So this is what rural settlement and urban settlements are and their characteristics are. But one thing we should be at the end should also know that usually the way whatever we have also discussed, we talked about rural and urban as binaries, as two opposite entities altogether. Okay, so usually rural and urban are looked at dichotomous. I mean, rural is completely different and urban is completely different. So what is rural is not urban. What is urban is not rural. So there is very strict division, strict line drawn between rural and urban. But what usually we find that with few exceptions of planned cities, most of the urban cities actually they evolve through a village. So a city is actually was a village in the past. So a village started growing and then it becomes a city. So rural transforms into urban over a period of time, right? So that is what in general we see. And as a result of that, okay, we find that there are in the city, we find rural characteristics, right? In India, or there is a word called Gauthan. So, I mean, within a village also, within the city also, we find some areas which are rural in nature. They look very rural, no, because those are the older areas in the city. Those were the core of the city where the first settlement evolved and then gradually grew and expanded to become a city. So we find that urban society contains some rural features, while rural society also possess some urban characteristics, because villages which are especially closer to the cities are also influenced by cities, right? So the point is that rural and urban need not be considered every time as a dichotomous, as if they are two different things completely. Okay, but we should understand there is a time link between the two. So urban society finds its birth in the rural society. So a city takes birth from a village, and therefore there is a connection. And so in the modern city, we do find some localities, some places with a rural society or with having a features of a rural settlement. Obviously, there is a point when the city develops to such an extent, it becomes too large, it develops to that extent, which we'll talk about in classification of urban settlement, that gradually those traces of rural society of the past completely wiped out at a certain point of time. But in general, we do find that rural society and urban society they have the features of each other. So in that way, rural and urban are not completely different from each other. Okay, so there is a very intimate relationship between the two in terms of time as well as in terms of space. So I hope you have understood in this session what do we mean by settlement, what is rural settlement, what is urban settlement, what are the different characteristics of rural settlement and urban settlement. And also, as lastly I have pointed out, that both these things, rural and urban settlements, they should not be or need not be looked as dichotomous at the same time, but we can look at them as a continuum, as a part of the continuous process, right, where rural gradually transforms into urban. Okay, so that's all in this session. I hope you have understood the fundamentals of settlement and rural and urban settlement in particular. If any problem, you can always get in touch with me. Thanks a lot.